In Manhattan's gleaming financial district, a brilliant strategy analyst was about to discover the true cost of corporate ambition. What started as preparing a groundbreaking presentation took a shocking turn when they came face to face with systematic intellectual theft that would ignite a war for control of Wall Street's most prestigious investment firm. Sarah Mitchell wasn't your typical corporate employee. For 3 years, she had poured her soul into creating innovative financial strategies at Blackstone Holdings, known for her revolutionary approach to emerging markets analysis. When she watched the CEO's entitled son steal her months of meticulous work and claim it as his own path to promotion, she had no idea she was about to ally with the most dangerous enemy the Blackstone family had ever faced, a vengeful brother who had been plotting their destruction for 15 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah's confidence wavered the moment she approached the executive conference room at 8:58 a.m., 2 minutes before her scheduled presentation. Through the frosted glass doors, she could see figures already seated around the mahogany table, their voices carrying the animated discussion that typically preceded important meetings. Her heart rate quickened. She'd expected to arrive first, to set up her laptop and run through her opening remarks one final time. But as she reached for the door handle, Marcus Blackstone's voice floated through the glass with unmistakable clarity. As you can see in slide 15, the risk assessment model incorporates social media sentiment analysis, infrastructure development patterns, and climate change projections to create a predictive framework that anticipates market shifts months before conventional analysis. Sarah's blood turned to ice. Those were her exact words, her proprietary methodology, her revolutionary approach to emerging markets analysis. Her hand froze on the door handle as the terrible reality crashed over her like a collapsing building. She pushed the door open just wide enough to slip inside, her legs moving on autopilot while her mind reeled. The conference room's massive screen displayed slide 15 of her presentation, with Marcus standing confidently at the front, laser pointer in hand, addressing the 12-member executive board as if he'd spent months developing the analysis himself. The beauty of this framework, Marcus continued, clicking to slide 16 with practiced ease, is its ability to identify market opportunities that traditional models miss entirely. Take Vietnam's emerging tech sector, for instance. Sarah found herself sinking into an empty chair at the back of the room, her throat constricting as she watched her life's work being stolen in real time. Every slide, every data point, every innovative insight she'd labored over during countless late nights, all of it flowing from Marcus's mouth with the smooth confidence of someone who'd never doubted his right to claim others' achievements. Victor Blackstone sat at the head of the table, his steel-gray hair perfectly styled, his sharp features reflecting the ruthless intelligence that had built a financial empire from nothing. But now his face showed something Sarah had never seen before: genuine pride in his son. His eyes followed Marcus's movements with paternal approval, occasionally nodding at particularly insightful points, insights that belonged to Sarah. The projected ROI over 5 years is conservative at 340%, Marcus said, advancing to slide 28. But the real value lies in establishing first-mover advantage in markets that will define the next decade of international finance. Board member Catherine Wells leaned forward, her voice carrying the respect usually reserved for presentations that could reshape corporate strategy. Marcus, this analysis is extraordinary. The depth of research, the innovative modeling, it's exactly the kind of forward-thinking approach that will keep Blackstone ahead of our competitors. Sarah's vision blurred as rage and disbelief battled for control of her emotions. She wanted to stand up, to scream the truth about whose work they were praising, but her vocal cords felt paralyzed. Around the table, board members who had barely acknowledged her existence for 3 years were now hanging on every word that Marcus spoke, every word that should have been hers. "Thank you, Catherine," Marcus replied with the humility that only those born to privilege could master. I believe this strategy represents not just an investment opportunity, but a fundamental shift in how we approach emerging markets. Elena. Rodriguez sat 3 seats from Victor, her face carefully neutral, but her knuckles white where they gripped her leather portfolio. Their eyes met across the room, and Sarah saw her mentor's horror and helplessness reflected in her dark eyes. Elena knew. She understood exactly what was happening, but she was as powerless to stop it as Sarah. The presentation continued for another 10 minutes. 10 minutes of watching her intellectual property being claimed by someone who couldn't have identified Vietnam on a map 6 months ago. Marcus fielded questions with surprising competence, clearly having memorized her work thoroughly enough to defend it. When board member James Morrison challenged the methodology behind the climate change projections, Marcus responded with Sarah's exact reasoning, delivered with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted his right to be heard. Finally, Victor stood, his commanding presence silencing the room's murmur of appreciation. Marcus, this is exceptional work. The board and I are impressed not just by the analysis, but by the vision it represents. You've demonstrated exactly the kind of strategic thinking that Blackstone needs in its leadership. Sarah's world tilted on its axis as Victor's words sank in. Leadership. They weren't just stealing her presentation, they were using it to justify Marcus's promotion. Effective immediately, Victor continued, his voice carrying the weight of corporate decree. I'm promoting you to Senior Vice President of International Strategy. This presentation will serve as the foundation for our Southeast Asian expansion, with you leading the implementation. The room erupted in polite applause, board members offering congratulations to Marcus while Sarah sat frozen in her chair. Senior Vice President, the position she'd worked toward for 3 years, the recognition she'd earned through talent and dedication, handed to Marcus based on her stolen work. Dad, Victor, Marcus corrected himself with practiced humility. I'm honored by your confidence. I won't let you down. Sarah finally found her voice, standing on unsteady legs. Excuse me, she managed, her words barely above a whisper. I believe there's been a mistake. The room fell silent, all eyes turning toward her with expressions ranging from confusion to annoyance. Victor's gaze was particularly cold, as if her very presence was an interruption to an important moment. Ms. Mitchell, isn't it? Victor said, his tone suggesting he was struggling to remember her name. You're one of our analysts? The dismissal, in his voice cut deeper than outright hostility would have. I'm the senior strategy analyst who developed this presentation, Sarah said, her voice growing stronger despite the tremor in her hands. Every slide, every model, every projection, this is my work. Marcus's expression shifted to one of practiced confusion, his eyebrows rising in apparent surprise. Sarah, I think there might be some misunderstanding. While I appreciate your contributions to the research process, this strategic framework represents months of my own development and analysis. The gaslighting was so smooth, so believable, that Sarah almost questioned her own memory for a moment. But then she saw slide 32 displayed on the screen, her personal favorite, the risk assessment model she'd refined through dozens of iterations, and her certainty crystallized into cold fury. This is theft, she said, her voice carrying across the room with newfound strength. Intellectual property theft. Victor's face darkened with the kind of anger that had built corporate empires and destroyed careers. Ms. Mitchell, these are serious accusations. I suggest you consider your position here very carefully before making claims you cannot substantiate. Sarah looked around the room, searching for support, for recognition, for anything that might acknowledge the truth, but she found only closed faces and averted eyes. Even Elena seemed to shrink in her chair, her legal training warring with personal loyalty. I can substantiate every claim, Sarah said, but her voice was losing its power against the weight of institutional dismissal. The research files, the timestamps, the methodology, are all part of collaborative work done under Blackstone's umbrella, Marcus interrupted smoothly. Sarah, I understand you feel invested in this project, but strategic development is a team effort. Your contributions as a supporting analyst are appreciated, but the vision and leadership required for this level of strategy come from senior-level experience. The room's energy shifted decisively against her. Board members who had been impressed moments before now looked at her with the dismissive irritation reserved for subordinates who didn't know their place. Sarah felt herself shrinking under their collective gaze, her 3 years of 80-hour weeks and innovative thinking reduced to supporting analyst contributions. This meeting is concluded, Victor announced with finality. Marcus, congratulations again on your promotion. We'll expect implementation plans within the week. As board members filed out, offering Marcus congratulations and handshakes, Sarah remained standing alone at the back of the room. Elena approached her with careful steps, her face etched with sympathetic pain. Sarah, Elena whispered, I'm so sorry. This is wrong, Sarah finished, her voice hollow. This is wrong. But Elena could only nod helplessly as Marcus packed up his laptop, the laptop containing Sarah's stolen work, and followed his father from the room. The last thing Sarah heard was Victor's voice in the hallway. Exceptional work, son. This is exactly the kind of thinking that will secure our legacy. Alone in the conference room, Sarah stared at the blank presentation screen where her life's work had been claimed by someone else. The morning sun still streamed through the windows, but the light felt different now. Harsher, more revealing of truths she'd been naive enough to ignore. Her faith in meritocracy lay shattered on the mahogany table, and in its place, something colder and more calculating began to take root. The system she'd believed in had failed her completely, but that didn't mean she was powerless. It simply meant she needed to learn new rules for a game she was only now beginning to understand. Sarah walked back to her office in a daze, each step echoing hollowly in the suddenly alien corridors of Blackstone Holdings. The familiar spaces felt foreign now, as if she were seeing them through different eyes that no longer held faith, injustice or fairness, but instead searched for weaknesses and opportunities. Her desk looked exactly as she'd left it 2 hours ago, laptop closed, coffee cup half empty, presentation notes still scattered across the surface. But everything had changed. She was no longer Sarah Mitchell, rising analyst. She was Sarah Mitchell, victim of corporate theft, and the distinction carved itself into her consciousness like acid etching glass. Elena appeared in her doorway within minutes, closing the door behind her with deliberate care. Her usually composed demeanor cracked as she approached Sarah's desk, genuine anguish replacing her professional mask. That was inexcusable, Elena said without preamble, settling into the chair across from Sarah. What happened in there violated every principle of intellectual integrity this firm claims to uphold. Sarah looked up at her mentor, noting the way Elena's hands trembled slightly as she spoke. But it's not illegal, is it? That's what you're going to tell me. Elena's pause confirmed Sarah's suspicion before she spoke. Proving intellectual property theft in a corporate environment is nearly impossible, especially when the accused has unlimited legal resources and family connections. Marcus could claim collaborative development, cite company policies about shared ownership of work product, argue that your role was merely supportive. While I have what? My word against the CEO's son? Sarah, I've seen cases like this before. The legal system isn't designed to protect individual contributors against institutional power. Even if we could prove theft, the penalties would be minimal compared to what Marcus gained. Sarah felt something fundamental shift inside her chest, as if a weight she'd carried for years had suddenly dissolved. The naive faith that had driven her through Harvard, through 3 years of thankless work, through countless nights of believing that excellence would be rewarded, it simply evaporated. Then the legal system is useless, Sarah said, her voice eerily calm. If the rules don't protect people like us, maybe we need to stop following them. Elena leaned forward, alarm replacing sympathy in her dark eyes. Sarah, be very careful about the path you're considering. Anger can lead to decisions that destroy more than just your enemies. Before Sarah could respond, Amanda Foster burst through the door, her face flushed with indignation. The young analyst's fury was palpable, radiating from her like heat from a furnace. "I can't believe what I just heard!" Amanda exclaimed, her professional composure completely abandoned. "The entire analyst floor is talking about Marcus's brilliant presentation. They're calling it innovative, groundbreaking, and it's your work. Every single insight, every model, every projection." Sarah watched Amanda's outrage with a mixture of recognition and detachment. This was how she should feel, she realized. This was the appropriate response to injustice. But instead of anger, she felt something colder settling in her mind. Calculation. "Amanda, what do you know about corporate media relations?" Sarah asked, her question seemingly disconnected from the moment. "What do you mean?" Amanda's anger faltered, replaced by confusion. If someone were to leak information about questionable practices at Blackstone, how would that information reach the right journalists? Elena stood sharply, her chair scraping against the floor. "Sarah, absolutely not. You're talking about career suicide." "I'm talking about justice," Sarah replied, her voice remaining calm despite the revolutionary thoughts taking shape in her mind. "If the system won't protect us, maybe public exposure will." Amanda's eyes lit up with the dangerous enthusiasm of youth. "There are reporters who specialize in corporate corruption, financial journalists who would love a story about nepotism and intellectual theft at a major investment firm. This is not a game," Elena warned, her legal training overriding her personal sympathies. "Media exposure could trigger SEC investigations, lawsuits, criminal charges. You could lose everything." Sarah opened her laptop and began typing, her fingers moving with newfound purpose. "I've already lost everything that mattered. My work, my promotion, my faith in this place. All gone. What exactly am I supposed to protect now?" As she navigated through Blackstone's internal systems, Sarah's analytical mind began processing information differently. Instead of seeking opportunities for growth and improvement, she found herself cataloging vulnerabilities and inconsistencies. Her access to financial data, project files, and internal communications suddenly seemed less like professional resources and more like weapons. "Elena, in your experience, what kind of evidence would interest an investigative reporter?" Sarah asked, her tone conversational despite the dangerous territory they were entering. "Sarah, stop." Elena's voice carried genuine fear now. "I can't be part of this conversation. As senior legal counsel, I have obligations to this firm that supersede my personal feelings about what happened to you." The statement hung in the air between them, marking another relationship casualty of the morning's events. Sarah nodded slowly, understanding that Elena's position made her both valuable and unavailable as an ally. "I understand," Sarah said. "Thank you for everything you've taught me. About law, about corporate structures, about how power really works in places like this." Elena gathered her things with reluctant efficiency, pausing at the door. "Sarah, please remember that revenge often costs more than justice is worth. Don't let what happened this morning destroy who you are." After Elena left, Amanda moved closer to Sarah's desk, her voice dropping to a whisper. "What are you really thinking?" Sarah continued typing, accessing files she'd never examined from an adversarial perspective. Marcus's employment history, project assignments, performance reviews, all of it suddenly relevant in ways she'd never considered. "I'm thinking that Marcus Blackstone has built his entire career on other people's work," Sarah said, discovering patterns that would have been invisible to someone not looking for them. "And I'm thinking that someone should document that pattern before he steals from anyone else." Her research revealed a troubling consistency. every major project Marcus had claimed credit for showed signs of collaborative development, with key contributors often leaving the firm shortly after completion. The pattern was subtle enough to avoid casual notice, but clear enough for someone with Sarah's analytical skills to recognize. Amanda, do you remember David Chen from the Financial Tribune? The reporter who wrote that series on hedge fund irregularities? The one who won the Polk Award for financial journalism? Yes, why? Because I think he might be interested in a story about systematic intellectual property theft at one of Manhattan's most prestigious investment firms. Amanda's excitement was tempered by growing concern. Sarah, if you do this, there's no going back. This isn't just about your presentation anymore. You're talking about war. Sarah's fingers paused over the keyboard as the weight of Amanda's words settled over her. War. Yes, that's exactly what this was. Marcus Blackstone had fired the first shot when he stole her work, and the traditional rules of corporate engagement had proven useless for defense. Then maybe it's time to learn the rules of war, Sarah said, reaching for her phone. Amanda, do you still have David Chen's contact information? As Amanda fumbled through her contacts, Sarah felt the final pieces of her idealistic worldview crumble away. In their place, something harder and more pragmatic was taking shape. A understanding that in corporate America, mercy was weakness, and victory belonged to those willing to abandon conventional morality. The girl from Ohio who had believed in merit and fairness was gone. In her place sat someone prepared to fight fire with fire, armed with 3 years of insider knowledge and a newfound appreciation for the power of strategic destruction. The war for her professional life was about to begin, and Sarah Mitchell intended to win. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 3 days later, Sarah sat across from David Chen in a small cafe 12 blocks from Blackstone Holdings, watching steam rise from her untouched latte while the investigative journalist reviewed the documents she'd printed. David's reputation preceded him. A tenacious reporter whose exposés had toppled 3 major financial executives in the past 2 years. His Pulitzer nomination for uncovering the Meridian Capital scandal made him exactly the kind of ally Sarah needed. This is substantial, David said, his voice barely above a whisper as he flipped through photocopied performance reviews and project timelines. The pattern is clear once you know what to look for. Marcus Blackstone has claimed credit for work that shows collaborative fingerprints, and in each case, the primary contributors either left the firm or were marginalized shortly after. Sarah had spent the previous 72 hours methodically documenting everything she could access through Blackstone's internal systems. Her security clearance as a senior analyst provided entry to project files, employee records, and financial data that painted a damning picture of systematic exploitation. The Southeast Asian presentation was just the latest theft, Sarah explained, keeping her voice low despite the cafe's ambient noise. Look at the Henderson Industries acquisition strategy from 18 months ago. Marcus received a bonus and promotion for innovative risk assessment, but the actual architect was Jennifer Walsh. The analyst who transferred to Goldman Sachs? After her work was stolen and she was denied the promotion she'd earned. Jennifer was brilliant. Her modeling techniques were years ahead of industry standards. Marcus copied her methodology wholesale. David's pen moved rapidly across his notepad, capturing details that could anchor a devastating exposé. And the Petrov Energy restructuring? Michael Santos developed that entire framework. He's now working at a mid-tier firm in Chicago, blacklisted from major Wall Street positions after challenging the attribution. The journalist leaned back, his expression shifting from professional interest to genuine outrage. How many people are we talking about, Sarah? At least 7 major thefts over 3 years, possibly more. Marcus has built his entire career on intellectual parasitism, and Victor Blackstone has enabled it every step of the way. David's smartphone buzzed with an incoming call. the screen displaying a number he didn't recognize. He declined the call and returned his attention to the documents. What about internal complaints, HR reports? Surely someone tried to challenge this through official channels. Sarah's laugh carried no humor. Blackstone's HR department reports directly to Victor. Any complaints about Marcus disappear into a bureaucratic black hole. The few people who pressed issues found themselves reassigned to dead-end projects or encouraged to seek opportunities elsewhere. Corporate intimidation, David muttered, making additional notes. This could be bigger than just intellectual theft. We're looking at a systematic pattern of workplace retaliation and abuse of power. As David continued his questions, Sarah felt her phone vibrate with an urgent text from Amanda. Marcus asking questions about your recent file access. Be careful. Sarah's blood chilled as she realized the implications. Her investigation had left digital footprints that security protocols would eventually flag. Marcus's suspicions meant her window for gathering evidence was closing rapidly. David, I need to ask you something, Sarah said, interrupting his review of the Henderson files. How quickly could you verify the offshore components of Blackstone's operations? Offshore components? David's eyes sharpened with predatory interest. What exactly are you suggesting? Sarah pulled out her laptop, navigating to files she'd discovered during her deep dive into Blackstone's financial structures. Marcus isn't just stealing individual presentations. He's been using stolen intellectual property to secure major client deals, and those deals involve transactions through shell companies in the Cayman Islands and Luxembourg. The journalist's excitement was palpable as Sarah showed him transaction records that revealed a complex web of offshore accounts. These companies don't have legitimate business operations, she continued. They exist solely to process Blackstone client funds through tax avoidance schemes that skirt SEC regulations. Jesus, David whispered, photographing the laptop screen with his phone. This isn't just plagiarism anymore. We're looking at potential securities fraud, tax evasion, and regulatory violations that could trigger federal investigations. Sarah's analytical mind had spent days mapping the connections between Marcus's stolen strategies and the offshore transactions they enabled. Her presentation on Southeast Asian markets wasn't just intellectual property, it was the foundation for a $500 million client acquisition that would flow through questionable international channels. The beauty of targeting emerging markets, Sarah explained, is that regulatory oversight is minimal. Marcus can implement stolen strategies through offshore vehicles without triggering the compliance reviews that domestic transactions require. David's pen moved frantically as he absorbed the implications. Sarah, this story could bring down the entire Blackstone operation. We're not just talking about career consequences. This is federal prison territory. The weight of that realization settled over Sarah like a heavy blanket. She'd begun this investigation seeking justice for her stolen presentation, but she'd uncovered evidence of systematic criminality that extended far beyond workplace theft. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a call from Elena Rodriguez. Sarah declined it, recognizing that her mentor could no longer afford association with what she was planning. There's something else, Sarah said, pulling up additional files. Victor Blackstone's brother Thomas was forced out of the company 15 years ago. According to the corporate records I accessed, the split wasn't amicable. Thomas owned 40% of Blackstone Holdings when he left. Hostile departure? Extremely hostile. The board minutes from that period are sealed, but the financial settlements suggest Thomas was bought out under duress. He received far less than his stake was worth, and he was bound by non-disclosure agreements that prevented him from discussing the circumstances. David leaned forward with interest. Where is Thomas Blackstone now? That's what I intend to find out. If he has grievances against Victor and Marcus, he might be willing to share information that could support your investigation. As they concluded their meeting, David gathered the photocopied documents with the careful reverence of someone handling evidence that could reshape financial journalism. Sarah, I need you to understand the risks you're taking. Once this story breaks, there will be retaliation. Victor Blackstone didn't build his empire by accepting challenges passively. Sarah felt a cold smile cross her lips as she closed her laptop. Let him retaliate. I'm done being afraid of people who built their power on other people's work. Walking back toward Blackstone Holdings, Sarah's phone rang with another call from Elena. This time she answered, prepared for the conversation she'd been avoiding. Sarah, you need to stop whatever you're planning. Elena's voice carried genuine panic. Marcus has noticed irregular access patterns in the system. Security is conducting an audit of recent file requests. How much time do I have? Maybe hours. Sarah, they're going to fire you, and if they find evidence of unauthorized data access, they could pursue criminal charges. Sarah paused on the sidewalk, pedestrians flowing around her as she processed Elena's warning. Her investigation had provided David with enough material for a preliminary story, but the real evidence, the documents that could prove systematic fraud, remained. Locked in Blackstone's systems. Elena, I need one more favor. Can you get me Thomas Blackstone's contact information? Sarah, no. I can't be involved in whatever you're planning. I won't be. The line went dead, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts and the growing certainty that her time as a Blackstone employee was measured in hours rather than days. But instead of fear, she felt a strange liberation. The naive analyst who had believed in corporate fairness was gone, replaced by someone prepared to fight institutional corruption with whatever weapons came to hand. Marcus Blackstone had stolen her work, but in doing so, he'd awakened something far more dangerous than a disgruntled employee. He'd created an enemy who understood the system from the inside and had nothing left to lose. The war was escalating, and Sarah Mitchell was ready for whatever came next. Finding Thomas Blackstone required resources that Elena could no longer provide, but Sarah's analytical skills and desperate determination proved sufficient. Corporate records led to property holdings led to business registrations, and business registrations led to a private equity firm operating from a modest office building in Brooklyn Heights. The address felt like a deliberate choice, close enough to Manhattan's financial district to remain relevant, distant enough to signal independence from its power structures. Thomas Blackstone bore only superficial resemblance to his brother Victor. Where Victor projected ruthless authority, Thomas emanated calculated patience. His silver hair was longer, his expensive suit more understated, and his handshake carried the measured strength of someone who had learned to choose his battles carefully. At 62, he moved with the deliberate economy of a predator who had waited 15 years for the right moment to strike. Ms. Mitchell, Thomas said, gesturing toward a chair in his spartanly furnished office. I confess, your call intrigued me. It's been years since anyone from Blackstone Holdings has sought my perspective. Sarah had spent 2 days crafting her approach, understanding that Thomas represented either her greatest potential ally or her most dangerous enemy. His willingness to meet on short notice suggested he maintained active interest in his former company's affairs. Mr. Blackstone, I believe we have mutual interests regarding your brother's business practices, Sarah began, choosing her words with the precision of someone walking through a minefield. Specifically, concerning systematic abuse of intellectual property and employee exploitation. Thomas's expression remained neutral, but Sarah detected a flicker of interest in his gray eyes that shared Victor's intelligence but lacked their predatory coldness. That's quite an accusation. May I ask what evidence supports such claims? Sarah opened her laptop and displayed the documentation she'd assembled. Marcus's pattern of theft, the offshore transactions, the systematic marginalization of talented employees whose work had been appropriated. Thomas reviewed each document with the methodical attention of someone who understood complex financial structures intimately. "Impressive research," Thomas said after 20 minutes of silent review. Victor always did prefer building his empire on other people's foundations. I suppose some habits never change. The comment carried decades of accumulated bitterness, confirming Sarah's suspicion that Thomas's departure from Blackstone Holdings had left permanent scars. She sensed an opportunity to probe deeper. "What happened 15 years ago?" Sarah asked directly. "The corporate records suggest your exit wasn't voluntary." Thomas's smile held no warmth. Victor discovered that I had been documenting his questionable business practices that bore striking resemblance to what you've uncovered. When I attempted to address my concerns through proper channels, he orchestrated my removal through a manufactured crisis that left me with two choices: accept a settlement that amounted to theft, or face criminal charges for alleged securities violations. Sarah's blood ran cold as the implications became clear. He framed you. Victor has always been skilled at making problems disappear. Employees, evidence, ethical concerns, all managed through carefully orchestrated campaigns that destroy reputations while maintaining plausible deniability. The revelation transformed Sarah's understanding of what she was facing. This wasn't simply corporate nepotism or workplace theft. It was systematic criminality protected by institutional power and unlimited legal resources. Her stolen presentation was merely the latest casualty in a decades-long pattern of exploitation. However, Thomas continued, his tone shifting toward something more predatory, Victor's greatest strength has always been his greatest weakness. His absolute need to control everything makes him vulnerable to coordinated pressure applied at multiple points simultaneously. Sarah leaned forward, recognizing that Thomas was transitioning from sharing information to proposing action. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that your stolen presentation represents more than personal injustice. It's the key to destroying an empire built on theft and corruption." Thomas's fingers drummed against his desk with calculated rhythm. "For 15 years, I've been acquiring assets, building alliances, and positioning myself for the moment when Victor's crimes would finally catch up with him." Sarah's analytical mind began processing the implications. A hostile takeover. More than that, a complete restructuring that would strip Victor and Marcus of their ill-gotten power while exposing the criminality that enabled their success. Thomas opened a thick folder that had been sitting on his desk throughout their conversation. "I currently control, through various shell companies and investment vehicles, approximately 37% of Blackstone Holdings' outstanding shares." The number hit Sarah like a physical blow. Thomas wasn't just a disgruntled former employee. He was a major shareholder who had been quietly maneuvering for over a decade. That's enough to trigger SEC disclosure requirements. Only if the holdings were concentrated in a single entity, distributed across multiple vehicles. With careful timing, they remain below individual reporting thresholds while maintaining collective leverage. Sarah stared at the documents Thomas was showing her, recognizing the sophistication of a strategy that had been years in development. "You've been planning this since you left." "I've been preparing for the opportunity to achieve justice through appropriate channels. Your situation, combined with the evidence you've gathered, provides the catalyst I've been waiting for." Before Sarah could respond, her phone buzzed with an urgent text from Amanda. "Marcus confronted me about your file. Access. Security is looking for you. Don't come back to the office." The message confirmed what Sarah had suspected. Her time as a Blackstone employee had ended. But instead of fear, she felt a strange liberation. Marcus's move against her had eliminated her last reason to consider restraint. "It appears I no longer have a position to protect," Sarah said, showing Thomas the message. "Marcus has forced my hand. Perhaps that's for the best. Moral flexibility requires motivation, and comfortable employees rarely possess sufficient motivation for truly transformative action. The comment struck Sarah as both accurate and chilling. Thomas was offering her the chance to achieve total victory over her enemies, but the price would be embracing methods that would have horrified her idealistic former self. "What exactly are you proposing?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew. "Your presentation isn't just stolen intellectual property, it's the strategic foundation for Blackstone's next major expansion. If that expansion were to fail catastrophically, if clients were to lose confidence in the firm's competence, if regulatory scrutiny were to intensify at precisely the wrong moment." Thomas's smile was arctic. "Well, market confidence is a fragile thing." Sarah understood the subtext. Thomas wasn't just planning to acquire control of Blackstone Holdings. He intended to destroy it first, ensuring that Victor and Marcus lost everything before being stripped of power entirely. "The offshore accounts you discovered provide the perfect vehicle," Thomas continued. "Strategic exposure of those transactions could trigger SEC investigations, client withdrawals, and stock price collapse that would create optimal conditions for acquisition at distressed valuations. And after the takeover? Victor would be removed immediately. Marcus would face criminal charges for securities fraud. The firm would be restructured under new management committed to actual ethical practices." Thomas paused, studying Sarah's expression carefully. "You would be appointed as Senior Vice President of Strategic Development, with full authority to implement the international expansion strategy you developed." The offer was everything Sarah had originally wanted: recognition, authority, and the chance to see her vision implemented on a massive scale. But it came attached to a plan that would destroy hundreds of careers and devastate innocent employees whose only crime was working for a corrupt organization. "I need time to consider this," Sarah said, though part of her already knew her answer. "Of course, but don't take too long. Market opportunities have limited windows, and Marcus is likely implementing security measures that will make future evidence gathering considerably more difficult." As Sarah left Thomas's office, her mind raced with the implications of what she'd learned. The quiet analyst seeking justice for her stolen work had uncovered a conspiracy that reached back 15 years and involved systematic criminality at the highest levels of corporate power. The choice before her was stark: accept her victimization and fade into obscurity, or join forces with Thomas Blackstone in a campaign that would either destroy her enemies completely or consume her in the process. Walking back toward Manhattan, Sarah realized she had already made her decision. Marcus Blackstone had stolen her work, but in doing so, he had awakened something far more dangerous than a disgruntled employee. He had created a weapon that Victor's greatest enemy could wield with devastating effect. Sarah's decision crystallized during the subway ride back to Manhattan, the rhythmic clacking of train wheels providing counterpoint to her racing thoughts. By the time she emerged from the Wall Street station, she had crossed a line from which there would be no return. Thomas Blackstone's offer wasn't just an opportunity for revenge. It was a chance to reshape an entire corporate empire according to principles of actual merit rather than inherited privilege. Her phone buzzed constantly with missed calls from Elena and increasingly frantic texts from Amanda, but Sarah ignored them all. Those relationships belonged to her former life, when she still believed the system could be reformed from within. Now she understood that true change required destruction, followed by reconstruction. The next morning, Sarah met Thomas at a private dining room in the Meridian Club, an exclusive establishment where Manhattan's financial elite conducted business away from SEC oversight and media scrutiny. Thomas had spent the evening reviewing her personnel file, her academic records, and her professional accomplishments with the thoroughness of someone preparing for war. "Your strategic capabilities exceed what I initially expected," Thomas said, sliding a leather portfolio across the mahogany table. "The offshore analysis you provided wasn't just evidence gathering, it was comprehensive financial intelligence that demonstrates remarkable analytical sophistication. Sarah opened the portfolio to find detailed schematics of Blackstone Holdings' corporate structure, complete with subsidiary relationships, shareholder distributions, and debt obligations. The complexity was staggering, representing decades of carefully constructed financial architecture designed to maximize profit while minimizing regulatory oversight. The beauty of Victor's empire, Thomas explained, is that its sophistication makes it vulnerable to coordinated attack. Every offshore entity, every shell company, every tax avoidance mechanism represents a potential pressure point for someone who understands the system's dependencies. Sarah studied the documents with growing appreciation for the scope of Thomas's preparation. "You've been mapping this for 15 years. I've been building the tools necessary to dismantle what Victor stole from me. Your presentation simply provides the perfect catalyst for implementation." Thomas outlined the takeover strategy with clinical precision. Sarah's stolen Southeast Asian expansion plan was already being fast-tracked through Blackstone's approval process, with Marcus scheduled to present implementation details to major clients within the week. The plan's success would generate massive capital inflows that would be processed through the offshore entities Sarah had identified, entities that Thomas could expose to regulatory scrutiny at precisely the moment they contained maximum client funds. Simultaneous SEC complaints, client notifications, and media exposure would trigger panic withdrawals that Blackstone couldn't cover through liquid assets, Thomas explained. The resulting cash flow crisis would force emergency capital raising at distressed valuations, creating optimal conditions for acquisition. Sarah felt a chill of recognition as she grasped the elegance of the strategy. You're not just planning to buy the company, you're going to crash it first. Controlled demolition followed by reconstruction under competent management. Victor built his empire on theft and corruption. I intend to replace it with something that actually rewards merit. The plan required Sarah to maintain her access to Blackstone's internal systems long enough to gather final evidence and monitor the implementation timeline. Thomas had prepared a cover story. Sarah was supposedly joining his private equity firm as a strategic consultant, providing plausible explanation for her departure from Blackstone while maintaining the appearance of normal career progression. "Marcus will be suspicious," Sarah warned. "He's already questioning my file access patterns. Let him be suspicious. Paranoia will drive him toward mistakes that serve our purposes. Desperate people make poor decisions, and poor decisions create opportunities." That afternoon, Sarah returned to Blackstone Holdings for what she knew would be the last time as an employee. The familiar corridors felt different now. Not like the workplace where she'd invested 3 years of her life, but like enemy territory where every interaction carried strategic implications. Amanda was waiting at Sarah's desk, her face pale with anxiety. "Where have you been? Marcus has been asking everyone about your recent activities. He knows you accessed files outside your normal project scope." Sarah felt a pang of guilt as she looked at Amanda's worried expression. Her protégé had done nothing wrong beyond trusting someone who was no longer worthy of that trust. "Amanda, I need you to listen carefully. In the next few days, things at Blackstone are going to change dramatically. When they do, I want you to distance yourself from me completely." "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about protecting your career from the choices I'm making. Some lines, once crossed, can't be uncrossed. I don't want to drag you down with me." Before Amanda could respond, Marcus appeared at Sarah's cubicle with 2 security guards flanking him. His usual charm had been replaced by cold authority, and his blue eyes held the same predatory calculation Sarah had seen in his father's gaze. "Ms. Mitchell," Marcus said, his voice carrying across the analyst floor, "I need you to come with me for a security discussion." Sarah gathered her personal items with deliberate calm, hyper-aware that her colleagues were watching the confrontation, with barely concealed fascination. Office politics at Blackstone rarely played out so publicly, and Marcus's decision to involve security suggested he viewed her as a genuine threat. The security office was sterile and intimidating, designed to make employees feel vulnerable during disciplinary proceedings. Marcus dismissed the guards with a gesture, clearly intending to handle the interrogation personally. "You've been accessing files outside your authorization level," Marcus began without preamble. "Personnel records, financial documents, project, archives dating back several years. Care to explain why?" Sarah met his gaze directly, feeling no fear now that her decision was made. "Research for a presentation on corporate governance practices. I wanted to understand how successful projects were managed historically." Bullshit. Marcus's composure cracked slightly, revealing the insecurity that drove his need to steal others' work. "You're fishing for information to support some kind of complaint about intellectual property. Well, let me save you the trouble. No one will believe you. No one will care. And if you try to make trouble for this firm, you'll discover that your career in finance is over." The threat hung between them like a physical presence, and Sarah recognized it as the same intimidation that had silenced Marcus's previous victims. But unlike those earlier targets, she was no longer fighting alone. "Is that all?" Sarah asked mildly. "Because I have a job interview this afternoon?" Marcus's face flushed with anger at her apparent indifference to his threats. "You're terminated. Effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building, and you're banned from all Blackstone properties. Any attempt to contact current employees or access company systems will result in criminal charges." Sarah stood slowly, gathering her jacket and purse with unhurried movements. "Thank you for clarifying my status. It makes my next decisions much simpler." As security escorted her through the analyst floor, Sarah caught Elena's eye across the room. Her former mentor's expression held a mixture of disappointment and fear, clearly recognizing that Sarah had chosen a path that would lead far from the woman Elena had tried to nurture. Amanda watched with tears in her eyes as Sarah was led toward the elevators, understanding that her mentor's departure marked the end of something precious, the belief that good people could succeed through honest effort in a system designed to reward corruption. Standing on the sidewalk outside Blackstone Holdings for the final time, Sarah felt the weight of irreversible change settling over her. The building that had represented opportunity and advancement now loomed above her, like a monument to everything she intended to destroy. Her phone buzzed with a text from Thomas. "Phase 1 complete. Welcome to the war." Sarah deleted the message and walked away from her former life, knowing that when she next entered that building, it would be as a conqueror rather than a supplicant. Marcus Blackstone had made his choice when he stole her work. Now he would face the consequences of awakening an enemy who understood that mercy was weakness and victory required the complete destruction of everything he held dear. The point of no return was behind her, and Sarah Mitchell had never felt more certain of her purpose. 2 weeks after her termination, Sarah watched from Thomas's Brooklyn office as Blackstone Holdings' stock price began its carefully orchestrated descent. The first blow came from David Chen's exposé in the Financial Tribune, a devastating piece titled "Dynasty of Theft: How Blackstone Holdings Built an Empire on Stolen Ideas." The article meticulously documented Marcus's pattern of intellectual property theft, complete with testimony from former employees and internal documents that painted a picture of systematic exploitation. "The market is responding exactly as predicted," Thomas observed, monitoring real-time trading data on multiple screens. "Down 18% in the first hour of trading. Victor's damage control team is scrambling, but they're fighting a coordinated attack on multiple fronts." Sarah felt a cold satisfaction watching the numbers tumble. Each percentage point represented justice for every analyst whose work had been stolen, every employee who had been marginalized for challenging the Blackstone family's entitlement. But the newspaper article was only the opening salvo in Thomas's campaign. Phase 2 launched that afternoon when the Securities and Exchange Commission announced a formal investigation into Blackstone Holdings' offshore transactions. Sarah's meticulously documented evidence, provided anonymously through David Chen's sources, had triggered regulatory scrutiny of the shell companies that processed the firm's international deals. The timing was perfect. Marcus was scheduled to present the Southeast Asian expansion strategy to Blackstone's largest clients the following day. Victor will try to postpone the client presentations, Thomas predicted, studying market sentiment. Reports. But canceling at this point would signal panic and accelerate the stock decline. He's trapped between maintaining the appearance of business as usual and protecting himself from further exposure. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Amanda. Marcus is furious. Security found evidence of system breaches traced to your old login. They think you're still accessing files somehow. The message confirmed that Blackstone's paranoia was escalating exactly as Thomas had anticipated. Sarah's former colleagues were now viewing her as a dangerous enemy rather than a wronged employee, which served the psychological warfare component of their strategy perfectly. Let them think I'm some kind of cyber criminal, Sarah said, showing Thomas the message. Fear makes people stupid, and stupid people make exploitable mistakes. The transformation in her own mindset struck Sarah as she spoke. 6 months ago, she would have been horrified by the idea of deliberately spreading fear among former colleagues. Now she saw their anxiety as a tactical advantage to be leveraged for maximum effect. That evening, Thomas activated the third phase of their assault. Using his network of activist investors and disgruntled shareholders, he began circulating a letter demanding Victor Blackstone's immediate resignation as CEO. The letter cited systematic governance failures, regulatory violations, and ethical breaches that compromise shareholder value and expose the firm to catastrophic legal liability. Institutional investors hate uncertainty, Thomas explained as they reviewed the letter's initial circulation. They'll pressure Victor to step down rather than risk their portfolios being contaminated by association with criminal activity. Sarah found herself admiring the elegance of Thomas's strategy. Rather than simply attacking Blackstone Holdings directly, he was weaponizing the firm's own stakeholders against its leadership. Every client withdrawal, every investor concern, every regulatory inquiry created pressure that fed on itself in an accelerating spiral of institutional collapse. The following morning brought devastating news for the Blackstone family. Marcus's client presentation had been a disaster, with 3 major investors withdrawing their funds and demanding immediate return of capital. The Southeast Asian expansion, built on Sarah's stolen work, was indefinitely postponed as clients questioned the firm's competence and ethical standards. Victor called an emergency board meeting, Thomas reported, monitoring intelligence from his sources within Blackstone Holdings. He's trying to contain the damage, but board members are demanding explanations he can't provide without admitting to years of criminal activity. Sarah watched the unfolding chaos with growing exhilaration. Every crisis, every withdrawal, every angry client call represented vindication for the injustice she had suffered. But beneath the satisfaction lay a growing awareness of the collateral damage their campaign was causing. Amanda sent another message. They're laying off junior analysts. 40 people lost their jobs this morning. Sarah, what have you done? The text hit Sarah like a physical blow, forcing her to confront the human cost of her revenge. 40 analysts, people, like her former self, hard-working professionals who had committed no crime beyond working for a corrupt organization, were now unemployed because of choices she had made. Acceptable casualties, Thomas said when Sarah showed him the message. Those analysts will find positions elsewhere, probably at firms with better ethical standards. Their temporary unemployment is a small price for dismantling a system built on theft and corruption. Sarah nodded agreement, but Amanda's words echoed in her mind. The naive analyst who had believed in fairness and merit was truly dead, replaced by someone who could rationalize the destruction of innocent careers as acceptable casualties in a larger moral crusade. Her phone rang with a call from Elena Rodriguez. Sarah stared at the screen for several seconds before declining the call, understanding that her former mentor represented a life she could never reclaim. Elena would see only the destruction Sarah was causing, not the justice she was achieving. By week's end, Blackstone Holdings stock had lost 40% of its value. Victor was facing congressional subpoenas, Marcus was under FBI investigation for securities fraud, and Thomas's coalition controlled enough shares to demand representation on the board of directors. "We're ready for the final phase," Thomas announced during their Friday evening strategy session. "Victor will fight to the end, but his position is untenable. The question now is whether we acquire control through voluntary capitulation or forced liquidation." Sarah reviewed the acquisition documents Thomas had prepared, noting how thoroughly he had anticipated every aspect of Blackstone Holdings' collapse. Her stolen presentation had provided the catalyst, but Thomas's 15-year preparation had created the weapons that were now destroying his brother's empire. "What happens to Marcus?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Federal prosecutors are building cases for securities fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy. Marcus will likely face significant prison time, assuming he doesn't flee the country first. The prospect of Marcus's imprisonment should have provided Sarah with complete satisfaction, but instead she felt a strange emptiness. The boy from privilege who had stolen her work was being destroyed utterly, along with hundreds of innocent employees whose only crime was trusting in a system that had failed them all. "Are you having second thoughts?" Thomas asked, studying her expression with predatory intelligence. Sarah met his gaze directly, recognizing that any sign of weakness would compromise everything they had built. "No second thoughts. Marcus chose this path when he stole my work. I'm simply ensuring he faces the consequences." But even as she spoke the words, Sarah wondered if the woman who had sought simple justice for her stolen presentation would recognize the architect of institutional destruction she had become. The line between justice and revenge had disappeared entirely, consumed by a hunger for victory that demanded ever greater sacrifices from everyone except herself. The trap had sprung perfectly, catching not just Marcus and Victor Blackstone, but also the innocent people whose lives had been built around the corrupt empire Thomas was systematically dismantling. And Sarah Mitchell, once a believer in fairness and merit, had become the instrument of that destruction. Victory was within reach, but the cost was becoming clearer with each passing day. 3 weeks into the siege of Blackstone Holdings, Sarah stood in Thomas's office, watching CNBC's coverage of congressional hearings where Victor Blackstone was being systematically dismantled by lawmakers demanding answers about offshore tax schemes and regulatory violations. The man who had dismissed her as a supporting analyst now appeared hollow-eyed and defensive, his empire crumbling in real time on national television. "The acquisition documents are ready for final review," Thomas said, sliding a thick folder across his desk. "Blackstone Holdings will be delisted by month's end, and we'll purchase the assets at liquidation prices. Your position as Senior Vice President of Strategic Development will be announced simultaneously with the completion." Sarah should have felt triumph, but instead she stared at the folder with growing unease. Everything she had originally wanted, recognition, authority, the chance to implement her strategic vision, was finally within reach. Yet the path to victory had transformed her into someone she barely recognized. Her phone buzzed with another message from Amanda, the 7th in 3 days. "Please call me. I need to understand what's happening." Sarah had ignored all previous attempts at contact, but Amanda's persistence suggested something more urgent than curiosity about her former mentor's role in Blackstone's collapse. Against her better judgment, Sarah stepped outside Thomas's office and returned the call. "Sarah, thank God." Amanda's voice was thick with emotion. "I need to see you. There are things about the acquisition that you don't understand." "Amanda, I told you to distance yourself from me, for your own protection." "Protection from what? From discovering that Thomas Blackstone has been planning something far worse than a simple takeover? Amanda's words carried desperation that cut through Sarah's defensive barriers. "Meet me at the coffee shop near Columbia. 1 hour, please." The line went dead, leaving Sarah with a growing sense that the victory she had pursued was about to reveal costs she hadn't anticipated. Thomas was deep in conversation with his legal team, finalizing acquisition details that would transfer control of Blackstone Holdings to his carefully constructed consortium. 40 minutes later, Sarah sat across from Amanda in a crowded cafe near Columbia University, studying her former protege's haggard appearance. The eager analyst who had once marveled at Sarah's presentation now looked exhausted and haunted, as if she had uncovered truths that had shattered her worldview as completely as Sarah's had been. "Thomas Blackstone isn't planning to rebuild the firm," Amanda said without preamble. "He's going to strip it for parts and sell everything to competitors. Every employee will lose their jobs, every client relationship will be liquidated, and the intellectual property will be auctioned to the highest bidders." Sarah felt ice forming in her stomach. "Where did you hear this?" "I've been working as a paralegal for Elena Rodriguez since the layoffs began. She's been reviewing the acquisition documents as part of the regulatory approval process." Amanda pulled out a tablet, displaying financial projections that painted a devastating picture. "Look at the timeline. Thomas's consortium plans to complete asset liquidation within 6 months of acquisition. There's no provision for ongoing operations, no budget for employee retention, nothing that suggests rebuilding." The data was undeniable, and Sarah's analytical mind processed the implications with growing horror. Thomas hadn't been planning to reform Blackstone Holdings. He intended to destroy it completely, extracting maximum value from its corpse while ensuring that Victor's empire disappeared entirely from the financial landscape. "Sarah, he's been lying to you from the beginning. This isn't about justice or merit or building something better. It's about revenge so complete that nothing survives." Sarah's hands trembled as she reviewed Amanda's documentation. Every projection, every asset valuation, every liquidation schedule confirmed that Thomas's true goal was obliteration disguised as acquisition. Thousands of employees would lose their careers, not temporarily, but permanently, as the firm that had employed them simply ceased to exist. "There's more," Amanda continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. Elena found recordings of Thomas's conversations with consortium members. "He's been planning to frame you for securities fraud once the acquisition is complete. You're not going to be senior vice president of anything. You're going to be his scapegoat for the entire operation." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Thomas had played her perfectly, using her legitimate grievances and insider knowledge to facilitate a destruction campaign that would ultimately consume her along with everyone else. Her stolen presentation hadn't been the key to justice. It had been the weapon Thomas needed to complete 15 years of preparation for total revenge. "Elena tried to warn you," Amanda said, tears flowing freely now. "She's been calling because she discovered Thomas's real plan. He recorded every conversation you had with him, documented every piece of evidence you provided, and constructed a narrative that makes you the mastermind of the entire conspiracy." Sarah's phone buzzed with a message from Thomas. "Final signing meeting in 1 hour. Bring your identification for the VP paperwork." The casual tone of the message now felt sinister, and Sarah understood that she was walking into a trap as carefully constructed as the one that had destroyed the Blackstone family. Thomas had spent 15 years preparing for this moment, and she had been nothing more than a useful tool in a campaign of destruction that would ultimately claim her as its final victim. "What do I do?" Sarah asked, the question carrying all the weight of someone who had lost control of forces she had helped unleash. "Elena has been documenting everything. She thinks there might be a way to stop the acquisition, but you'd have to testify about Thomas's real plans. You'd have to admit your role in providing him with the information he used to destroy Blackstone." the choice crystallized with terrible clarity. Sarah could attend Thomas's signing meeting and complete her transformation into the scapegoat for his revenge campaign, or she could ally with Elena and Amanda to expose a conspiracy that would implicate her in systematic corporate destruction. If I testify against Thomas, what happens to Marcus? To Victor? They'll still face prosecution for their crimes, but the firm might survive long enough for legitimate restructuring. Thousands of jobs might be saved. Amanda leaned forward desperately. Sarah, you started this because Marcus stole your work. Don't let Thomas use that injustice to justify destroying innocent people's lives. Sarah stared at her reflection. In the cafe window, seeing a stranger who had traded every principle she once held for the promise of victory over enemies who had never deserved the destruction she had helped orchestrate. The idealistic analyst from Ohio was truly dead, but perhaps something of her moral foundation could still be salvaged from the wreckage. Her phone buzzed again with another message from Thomas. Don't be late. Everything we've worked for depends on the next hour. Sarah stood slowly, her decision crystallizing with the weight of irreversible consequence. She had chosen this path when she allied with Thomas, but she still retained the power to choose how it would end. Tell Elena I'll meet her at the Federal Building in 30 minutes, Sarah said, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had finally grasped the true cost of the war she had helped wage. It's time to face the consequences of what I've become. The reckoning had arrived, and Sarah Mitchell would meet it with whatever remained of the person she had once been. The Federal Building's marble corridors echoed with Sarah's footsteps as she walked toward a meeting that would determine not just her fate, but the future of thousands of employees whose lives hung in the balance of her decision. Elena Rodriguez waited in a small conference room, surrounded by legal documents and recording equipment that represented the last chance to prevent Thomas Blackstone's campaign of total destruction. Sarah. Elena's voice carried relief mixed with wariness as she stood to embrace her former protégé. I wasn't certain you would come. I almost didn't, Sarah admitted, settling into a chair across from Elena. Thomas is expecting me at his office in 20 minutes for the final acquisition signing. He thinks I'm going to help him complete the destruction of Blackstone Holdings. Elena activated the recording equipment with practiced efficiency. Before we begin, I need you to understand the full scope of what we're asking. Your testimony will expose Thomas's conspiracy, but it will also document your role in providing him with insider information and facilitating securities fraud. The Justice Department will offer immunity in exchange for cooperation, but your career in finance is over regardless. The words hung between them like a death sentence. Sarah had spent years building her professional reputation, and now she faced the choice between preserving it by completing Thomas's plan or destroying it by exposing the truth. Either path led to professional ruin, but only one offered the possibility of moral redemption. What happens to Marcus and Victor if I testify? They'll still face prosecution for their crimes, but the firm might survive long enough for legitimate restructuring. Under court supervision, thousands of jobs could be saved, and client assets could be protected from liquidation. Sarah's phone buzzed with increasingly urgent messages from Thomas. Where are you? The signing is scheduled to begin in 15 minutes. Then, Sarah, respond immediately. Our window is closing. Finally, if you're having doubts, remember that Victor and Marcus destroyed your career. Don't let misplaced sympathy derail the justice we've worked to achieve. The final message crystallized Sarah's understanding of how completely Thomas had manipulated her emotions. He had taken her legitimate grievances and weaponized them into a campaign of destruction that served his agenda rather than any recognizable form of justice. Elena, I need to know something. If Thomas had approached you 15 years ago with evidence of Victor's crimes, what would you have done? Elena's expression grew thoughtful. I would have built a case through proper channels, worked with regulators to expose the violations, and sought remedies that protected innocent parties while holding the guilty accountable. I wouldn't have spent 15 years planning revenge that destroys everything in its path. Even if the system had failed you? Even if Victor had framed you and stolen your life's work? Especially then. The moment we abandon legal and ethical constraints in pursuit of justice, we become the very corruption we claim to oppose. Sarah felt the weight of Elena's words settling over her like a burial shroud. She had abandoned every principle that once defined her, trading moral clarity for the intoxicating promise of total victory over enemies who had wounded her pride more than they had actually harmed her career prospects. Her phone rang with a call from Thomas. Sarah stared at the screen for several seconds before answering, understanding that her next words would determine the trajectory of countless lives. Thomas. Sarah, where are you? The consortium members are waiting, and Victor's legal team is preparing countermeasures that could complicate the acquisition if we delay much longer. I'm not coming. The silence stretched for nearly 10 seconds before Thomas's voice returned, carrying a coldness that revealed his true nature. That would be extremely unwise. You seem to have forgotten that I possess extensive documentation of your role in this operation. Without my protection, you'll face federal prosecution for conspiracy, securities fraud, and corporate espionage. I haven't forgotten anything. I remember that you recorded our conversations without my knowledge, manipulated my anger for your own purposes, and planned to make me the scapegoat for your 15-year revenge campaign. Thomas's laugh held no humor. You were always expendable, Sarah, a useful tool for accessing information and providing cover for the real operation. Did you honestly believe I would share power with someone naive enough to trust a stranger with her career and freedom? The contempt in his voice stripped away any remaining doubt about Sarah's decision. Thomas viewed her exactly as Marcus had, as a disposable resource to be exploited and discarded when no longer useful. The only difference was that Thomas had been more sophisticated in his manipulation. You're right about one thing, Sarah said, her voice gaining strength. I was naive. I believed your promises about justice and merit because I wanted to believe them. But I'm not naive enough to help you destroy innocent people's lives for the sake of your personal vendetta. You'll regret this decision. I'll ensure that every financial institution in Manhattan knows you're a corporate saboteur who can't be trusted with sensitive information. Then I'll find another career. At least I'll be able to look at myself in the mirror. Sarah ended the call and turned to Elena, who had listened to the conversation with growing admiration for the choice her former student was making. Are you ready to give your statement? Elena asked. Yes, but first, I need to call Amanda and tell her that some of the people I helped hurt might have a chance at survival. As Sarah began her formal testimony, detailing every aspect of Thomas's conspiracy and her role in facilitating it, she felt something she hadn't experienced. Since Marcus had stolen her presentation, genuine self-respect. The career she had built was ending, but the person she was becoming might actually be worthy of the ideals she had abandoned. 2 hours later, federal agents were executing search warrants at Thomas Blackstone's office, while Sarah sat in a government conference room, finally understanding the difference between justice and revenge. Justice sought to protect the innocent while holding the guilty accountable. Revenge sought destruction regardless of collateral damage. She had chosen revenge and nearly destroyed herself in the process. Now, perhaps, she could choose something better. Not the naive idealism of her youth, but a more mature understanding of how difficult principles were to maintain when tested by real adversity. Her phone buzzed with a text from Amanda. Thank you. Elena says the firm might survive. Sarah typed back, thank you for not giving up on me. The choice was made, and whatever consequences followed, Sarah Mitchell would face them as someone who had finally remembered the difference between justice and vengeance. 6 months after testifying against Thomas Blackstone, Sarah stood in the lobby of a federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan, watching news crews document the final chapter of the most sensational corporate conspiracy case in recent memory. Thomas had been sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for securities fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering, his 15-year plan for revenge ultimately becoming the instrument of his own destruction. The legal proceedings had unraveled. With surgical precision, once Sarah's testimony provided prosecutors with the roadmap to Thomas's conspiracy. His carefully constructed shell companies, his network of activist investors, and his sophisticated financial manipulation all collapsed under federal scrutiny. The man who had promised Sarah justice had instead delivered himself to the very system he had tried to subvert. Victor Blackstone received 8 years for tax evasion and regulatory violations, his empire of questionable business practices finally catching up with him after decades of operating in legal gray areas. Marcus faced 4 years for securities, fraud related to the intellectual property theft, though his sentence was reduced due to cooperation with prosecutors investigating the broader conspiracy. Blackstone Holdings had survived, barely. Under court-supervised restructuring, the firm was slowly rebuilding its reputation while implementing compliance protocols that would have prevented the systematic abuses that had defined its previous culture. Amanda Foster had been promoted to senior analyst, leading a team responsible for ensuring that intellectual property attribution became a cornerstone of the new corporate governance structure. Sarah's own fate had been more complex. The immunity agreement had protected her from criminal prosecution, but her career in finance was indeed over. No major investment firm would risk hiring someone whose insider knowledge had been weaponized so effectively against a competitor, regardless of her eventual cooperation with authorities. Sarah. Elena Rodriguez approached across the courthouse lobby, her expression mixing relief with lingering concern. "How are you holding up?" "Better than I expected," Sarah replied honestly. "Strange as it sounds, I feel more at peace now than I did when I thought I was winning." Elena nodded with understanding. Justice often feels different than we imagine it will. Less satisfying, more complicated, but ultimately more sustainable than revenge. They walked together toward the courthouse steps, where reporters waited, to capture final statements from the key figures in the case. Sarah had avoided media attention throughout the proceedings, but today felt different, like a conclusion that deserved acknowledgement. "Ms. Mitchell," a reporter called out as they emerged into the afternoon sunlight, "do you regret your decision to expose Thomas Blackstone's conspiracy, even though it ended your career in finance?" Sarah paused, considering the question carefully. "I regret the choices that led me to that position. I regret allowing my anger to cloud my judgment, and I regret the harm that came to innocent people because of my actions. But exposing the truth? No, I don't regret that." "What's next for you professionally?" "I'm starting a consulting practice, focused on corporate governance and ethical compliance. Apparently, there's significant demand for someone who understands how institutional corruption develops and how to prevent it." The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that her expertise in corporate malfeasance, gained through participation rather than observation, had become her most valuable professional asset. Several mid-tier firms had quietly approached her about developing internal audit procedures that could identify the kind of systematic abuses that had thrived at Blackstone Holdings. As the reporters dispersed, Sarah found herself alone with Elena on the courthouse steps. Manhattan's financial district sprawled before them, its glass towers reflecting the late afternoon sun like monuments to ambitions both noble and corrupted. "Elena, can I ask you something? Do you think the system actually works? After everything we've seen, everything we've been through, does justice actually exist in places like this?" Elena was quiet for a long moment, studying the cityscape, with the contemplative expression of someone who had spent decades navigating the intersection of law and power. "The system works imperfectly, slowly, and often unfairly," she said finally. "But it works better than the alternatives." Thomas spent 15 years planning the perfect revenge, and it ultimately destroyed him. Victor and Marcus built their careers on theft and corruption, and they're now in federal prison. You chose to expose the truth despite enormous personal cost and you're building something better from the wreckage. And thousands of people nearly lost their jobs because I was angry about a stolen presentation. And thousands of people kept their jobs because you found the courage to choose justice over revenge when it mattered most. Elena placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder. The measure of character isn't whether we make mistakes, it's whether we find the strength to correct them when we recognize they're wrong. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Amanda. Saw the news coverage. Proud of you for choosing the hard path. Coffee tomorrow? The message carried more weight than Amanda probably realized. For the first time since this entire ordeal began, Sarah felt genuinely proud of a choice she had made. Not the hollow satisfaction of defeating enemies, but the deeper contentment that came from acting according to principles rather than emotions. I should go, Sarah said, gathering her things. I have a meeting with a client who wants to discuss implementing whistleblower protections for their analyst division. Any regrets about leaving finance? Sarah looked up at the towers of Lower Manhattan, seeing them differently than she had as an ambitious analyst hungry for recognition. They no longer represented a ladder to climb or a system to conquer, but simply buildings where imperfect people struggled with the eternal challenge of balancing personal ambition with ethical responsibility. No regrets, she said. I'm finally doing work that matters for reasons I can actually defend. Walking away from the courthouse, Sarah felt the weight of the past months settling into something approaching wisdom. She had learned that revenge was a poison that destroyed the seeker more completely than the target, that justice required patience and principle rather than anger and cunning, and that true victory meant building something better rather than simply tearing down what existed. The naive analyst from Ohio was gone forever, as was the calculating strategist who had allied with Thomas Blackstone. In their place walked someone harder and more realistic than the first, but more principled and self-aware than the second. Someone who understood that the real measure of success wasn't how completely you could destroy your enemies, but how well you could maintain your integrity while fighting for what you believed was right. Sarah Mitchell had finally learned the difference between justice and vengeance, and while the lesson had cost her everything she thought she wanted, it had given her something far more valuable: the ability to look at herself in the mirror and recognize someone worthy of respect. The war was over, and she had won the only victory that actually mattered. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.